I need all these theologians to come out from among them and answer this question for me.
All right, let's see it.
Eve eats the apple because the serpent leads her to do it. Temptation gets the best of her and she does it. But I'm curious because I have been told by several people that the apple wasn't even an apple.
So our story doesn't refer to an apple, it refers to a fruit, and this content creator corrects themselves in the comments saying I meant fruit, not apple. But an awful lot of people still intuitively associate the fruit from the Garden of Eden with an apple, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that in Old English, the word apple meant fruit. It didn't refer to the specific fruit we now know as an apple. And so in literature, in Old and then in Middle English, you overwhelmingly had apple used to describe this fruit. And then when that word began to refer to the specific fruit we now know as an apple, it just kind of stuck. So you had a lot of medieval artists painting the Garden of Eden and making the tree of the knowledge of good and evil an apple tree. And this was helped along by the fact that in Latin, the word for apple was malum, which could also mean evil. And so there was a little pun that made it more attractive to imagine that the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Garden of Eden was an apple. And that has kind of stuck with us.
And that it was a story that was procured by the Catholic Church as a way to teach children about the story of Genesis, but not to expose them to what really happened, which was the sexual sin of fornication and adultery between the serpent and Eve.
So the Catholic Church has absolutely nothing to do with this. That's just anti-Catholic sentiment. However, the idea that what was going on in the Garden of Eden was something of a sexual nature goes back pretty far. Now, these days people talk about the serpent seed theory, which is the idea that Eve had sex with the serpent. That was the partaking of the fruit. Nobody takes this seriously apart from conspiracy theorists, but it was in the late 19th and early to mid 20th century that we had a bunch of people advocating for this idea, and it was basically about white supremacy, because they wanted to generate this idea that there was a corrupt bloodline that was fundamentally evil, and they wanted to use this to promote the idea that white people were the other bloodline, the good bloodline. So the contemporary serpent seed theory is fundamentally based in white supremacy. However, you do have folks like Irenaeus in his book Against Heresies from the end of the 2nd century CE saying that Gnostics were claiming that the sin of Eve in the garden was adultery with the serpent. Now, we can't find any example of that in any Gnostic writings, and Irenaeus is not incredibly detailed about that claim. This does go back to the very early years of Christianity and probably has origins in allegorical interpretations of these stories that probably predate Christianity, probably arise from Greco-Roman period Judaism. We have folks like Philo engaged in allegorical interpretations, and then within Christianity, Origen has a lot of theories about allegorical interpretation, and then Augustine in the late 4th and early 5th century CE was a Christian who started to talk about the fall as primarily involving the rise of what he calls concupiscence or lust. And his idea was that sex prior to the fall was just kind of a normal event that was no big thing. But then sexual desire and lust was a product of the fall, and that's what makes sex such a big problem these days. And that is incorporating Greco-Roman philosophical ideas about sexual desire as one of the baser urges of the flesh, something that should be overcome. So sexual desire was considered a big problem within early Christianity, which is why a lot of people advocated for celibacy, and some prominent Christians even seem to have castrated themselves and advocated for castration as the way that you make yourself a eunuch for the sake of the kingdom of God, as Jesus talks about in Matthew 19, and tying that significant sin in with the sin from the Garden of Eden was something that was quite attractive. We get it picked up again in Milton's Paradise Lost, and it's probably not until around Freud and his psychosexual analysis, however, that we really begin to see this widespread idea that maybe what happened in the Garden of Eden was sexual sin, and that the eating of the fruit is just an allegory for what was going on. So while the story of the Garden of Eden originally didn't have anything to do with sexual desire or sexual sin or sexual activity, there have been a bunch of opportunities throughout the history of its transmission for people to interpret it and understand it and transmit it as something that was more about sex than just about the eating of a piece of fruit.
which is why they covered them up with the grape leaves, because they realized that they had committed a sin using these parts, and they were like, oh, I gotta cover the crime scene.
Yeah, people come up with silly ideas.
That's why they attacked, Eve's ability to give birth, because it was painful, because she had committed that sin. Like, I don't know why, but I'm so confused. Like, it's an apple, but some people have said that's what the historical evidence why it became an apple. I don't know if that's true. I just want to know why people say that.
Well, hopefully my account of how that reading came to be popular makes sense, but fundamentally what it's about is trying to make the story more meaningful and useful to people within their own social and historical and rhetorical circumstances. And if this is some kind of metaphor for something sexual going on that is in between the lines, it becomes a lot more interesting for a lot of people. It becomes a lot more salacious, and that makes it something more meaningful to a lot of people. So when you have the same stories being read for 2,000 plus years, they tend to get pretty stale, and so people tend to come up with ways to make them more interesting, which is why you have all kinds of people today making up all these silly theories about how the Hebrew means this, and you can read the story of Jesus into all the letters of the first word of Genesis 1:1 and all this nonsense. It's just to make what is a very, very old and ultimately a not incredibly interesting story more interesting, more meaningful, and allow the people who are sharing this more interesting story to gain more attention and more status. Hopefully that is helpful for you. And the fit for this video has been the death of Superman.